Let's resume the morning session with our last presentation, which is The Waters of Northern Canada, an Indigenous Perspective. At the time we planned this session, all of us felt that it was very important to get an Indigenous perspective on the situation in both Western and Northern Canada. And in part, that has to do with the fact that Indigenous people in these parts have been living with the processes and patterns of water and land and air for many, many generations. And indeed, their science, which is experiential science, is based on our long history in which, unlike Western science, the replications number in the hundreds rather than in the half dozens. And so we're very fortunate to have with us today Gordon Christie, who is professor of law at the University of British Columbia. Gordon is, in my mind, a particularly distinguished lawyer because he also has a PhD in philosophy. And even more, he got it from the University of California, which makes him triply well qualified. Since 2005, Gordon has been director of the Indigenous Legal Studies program at UBC, and before that he was director of the intensive program in Aboriginal Lands, Resources, and Government at the Osgoode Hall Law School. His research interests include Aboriginal law, legal theory, Indigenous legal theory, and he is, I hope I pronounced this correctly, he is he is an Indigenous person, and we are grateful to him for taking the time to be with us today. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Gordon Christie.
Thank you, Henry, and I'm pleased to be here today. This is not my usual setting. I usually go to law conferences and talk about the law, and I'm not doing that today for the most part. So this is something different for me, and I'm not sure how this is going to go. I haven't really thought this through that deeply. It's a bit of an experiment, and we'll see how things progress. So that's who I am, and I should say, it's the Peter A. Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia. Once somebody gives $30 million to you, you quickly change the name of the school. So that's where I'm at now. And if you could go to the next. Unfortunately, when I teach, which I'm very happy to be here today because I got to miss a class yesterday. When I teach, I use Word instead of PowerPoint because then students can take notes below the headings I give them. So I thought I'd do what I usually do, but it makes it difficult to scroll and move around here. So I'd like to start by just saying a bit about who I am. And this is, again, not a usual approach for me. I sometimes talk a bit about where I'm from, but because the talk today is about Indigenous perspectives on northern waters in northern Canada, I thought I'd say a bit about this. So my family is actually from Northeast Alaska. And I might as well just go to the map if we can, please. That'd be great. So apparently there's a button here somewhere, the top button.
It should be the right button.
There we go. Well, you can't quite see it, but actually this area right here is where my family is traditionally from. So we'd be a Inupiat, not a Nuvialuit. But there's a story there. So I want to tell you a little bit about the story and relate it to some of the things going on around water issues today. In 1946, just after the war, my grandparents and their children, including my mother, who was 13 at the time, were up in Barrow. Barrow became a gathering place for Inuit at that time because of the presence of the military during the Second World War. The military more or less pulled out, and so they thought that it would be best to head east. So they had one sled and 5 dogs with 8 people. Those people following the election know that there was a kind of an awkward remark made about big sleds and no dogs a few days ago in the election. This was actually that kind of situation. It was a fairly big sled, and there were very few dogs. So they started walking east, and they took them a year and a half to get down to a Klavik, right there. And so that's where my family is based right now, is a Klavik, although now probably most of my cousins and my family live in Inuvik. Inuvik was, as many probably know, was built by the Canadian government in the late 1950s as a central administrative place for the Western Arctic and for a military base to listen to the Soviets. And so I was born and raised in Nunavik, but most of my family has its roots in Aklavik. Now, the only person with memories of the walk from Alaska over to Aklavik right now alive is my uncle, who lives in Aklavik, Uncle Danny. And I was with him a few summers ago, and he was talking about what it was like along the coast. Along the Yukon Coast, this is the Yukon right here, and the Northwest Territory starts here. And when he was a boy, and they were living on land still, so they walked across, and even when they're living in Aklavik, they still lived a traditional way. And they would go to the coast in the summertime, and they would also go there in the winter for sealing and stuff. Well, in the summertime, they would use kayaks and umiaks, the larger boats, to travel around, but they were always dodging ice floes. Through pretty much the entire summer, they'd have to go around the ice. There were only a few weeks when the ice was off the coast in any significant way. Well, I was up on the coast with him talking about this a few years ago, and we couldn't see any ice, and you have to go to a satellite to get the picture of the ice. The ice is hundreds of kilometers off the coast for most of the summer now. The ice leaves a long time before, oh, that's nice, thank you. Well, you can see there, I guess if that's a satellite view, there's no ice there. That's had a lot of effects. I'm just gonna mention a couple of them. One is the ocean now has months and months during which it can impact on the coast. So there's an incredible amount of erosion happening along the coast now. This island right here, you see that is Herschel Island, and that's part of a park that is co-managed by the Inuvialuit, the community I'm now part of. And that island is disappearing, not rapidly. It'll be around for a while, but it is definitely being eroded away quite significantly. And my uncle maintains a cabin up along this part here, just in the Yukon side of that border. And in the last 15 years, he's had to move it back 3 times. And he's gotten to the point he can't move it back anymore. He's up against a significant cliff of some sort or hill. And it's because the ocean just keeps cutting away. And he's moved it back 150 meters, right? So, there are all kinds of beautiful slides this morning. I wish I had access to all those slides. I can go back to some of them and talk about some of these things, but you'll just have to remember them. There was a picture of a forest fire on, it looked like somewhere fairly north, boreal forest. Where's David? He's gone, he's left. Okay. Anyway, it was a wonderful picture, and I think it was pretty far north because the trees look pretty small. And what you see is the effect of climate change, and one effect is to dry out the tundra. And when you dry out the tundra, you have water that's released from the tundra, and that makes the undergrowth quite a bit drier. Forest fires are much more numerous up there. There's a lot of what's called slumping happening, where the ground, because the permafrost kind of held up the ground, when all that water is released, that creates a huge amount of subsidence. And so all along the coast, for example, there's an awful lot of slumping. Huge hills just come down to the ocean now. They slide all through the summer and fall. Okay, so that's just a bit about me. I was just trying to introduce myself. But the last thing I want to talk about here is something I'll come back to at the end. As I mentioned, my family ended up in Aklavik in 1947. And you're doing a really good job with this map. Could you make it a little bit bigger here, possibly, around Aklavik? Is it possible? And I'm scared about doing this, because I don't want to lose. Oh, great, wonderful, perfect. And then move on, that's wonderful, perfect. See this down here, well, if you go a little bit higher up, perfect, right there. This right here is the Peel River. The Peel River is coming into the Mackenzie right here. This is the end of the Peel as a autonomous unit on its own. And the Peel, the watershed of the Peel is fairly untouched, and there's been a matter going on before the courts the last couple of years you may have heard about, because the Yukon First Nations got into a bunch of modern treaties through the 90s and into the early 2000s. And in those treaties, which are covered by an umbrella agreement, there's a process set up for land use planning, and they've decided to do it on a watershed basis. And the Yukon government decided to go through this process of planning on a watershed level, and they set up the right kind of processes under this agreement, because the agreement actually dictates many of the rules and processes around this planning business. Well, what happened was the First Nations, pressed hard to protect most of the watershed, and the commission agreed with this to a certain extent. And so at the end of the day, they recommended that 80% of the Yukon, the Peel River watershed, be protected. The Yukon government didn't like that. And so they flipped that around. It's not quite exactly on its head, but it's somewhere around 20% or so. I think it's 29% is going to be protected under the Yukon's plan, as opposed to 80%, which is what the commission recommended. And this was tried as a matter under the treaty process, under the treaty rights that were established in the umbrella agreement, under the specific treaties a few years ago. About 6 weeks ago, we had arguments before the Yukon Court of Appeal because the trial judge very sensibly said, well, the treaty processes rule here. The government has to follow through what they agreed to under the treaties. And so the outcome should be that we actually don't just stamp the final report of the commission. We send things back to the last stages, and then the government gets a chance to toy with things at that point. But the government appealed that decision. So we should know what the Court of Appeal says sometime in the next couple of months, and then that'll probably go to the Supreme Court of Canada. So that's what I'll come back to. I just want to talk about that idea of doing water use planning on a watershed basis. It's land use planning, but it's really around a watershed. And the connection to my family is that you see the Peel River coming into the Mackenzie here, but actually there are two little channels come off here, and those are the ones, this one right here is the one that runs right by a clavic. So a clavic is actually in the Peel River watershed. And the whole Mackenzie Delta is, in a sense, once the Peel flows into the Mackenzie right there, then the rest of the Delta as well is part of the Peel River watershed. So we have an interest in what's going on with this litigation. Okay, so that's all by way of setting up. I usually only have 12 minutes to talk. It's such a luxury to have 35 minutes. I'd be wrapping up by now usually, but okay. Next, so an Indigenous perspective. I've been asked to do these kinds of talks for many years, and I'm often asked to provide Indigenous perspective, and I still don't know exactly what that means, but I've thought about it quite a bit because I'm asked to do it a lot. And I'm going to use this idea of a perspective through the rest of the talk, actually. I'm going to start with this and say a bit about what I think a perspective might be. I don't myself hold to these old ideas of perspectives that turn them into things called worldviews. Many in the room may be familiar with Safra Whorf and their work back in the 30s and 40s, and it was a bit overblown. This idea that we actually have, as collectives, ways of thinking about the world that structure the world around us. So there was work done, for example, with the Hopi, trying to show the Hopi actually had a different way of thinking of time, which made time different for themselves. And I don't go that far. I don't actually dismiss that, but I don't go that far. I think perspectives can play a role similar to that in terms of relationships. We are able to create we're able to create conceptions of relationships. As social groups, we construct meaning in certain areas. So in terms of how we think of ourselves and how we think we relate to other people, your social group is going to inform you as you mature as a young person into how you think of those things. So you have ways of thinking of yourself right now that aren't really reflective of the world per se, because the world doesn't tell you what these things are. Your social cultural setting has led you to think of things in certain ways. So you've been quietly indoctrinated into certain ways of thinking of what a self is, how you relate to others, and then how that self relates to the world. So I'm hopeful after listening to the two talks this morning that I've actually managed to somehow miraculously dovetail this talk with the things talked about this morning. We'll see. So if you go to the next screen. So, okay, I'm a little bit ahead of myself. That's good. This is mostly to keep me on track. This is not actually for you. This is, if I don't have these headings, then I wander a lot. So I'm talking about the fact that as meaning-generating collectives, as social groups, we do in fact create some of the parts of the world around us. We don't create the real world, and this is the material world. But we do create a reality around our social setting. So what I want to do is talk about this idea of value, because this is, I think, deeply embedded in the dominant perspective. I'm going to talk about the dominant perspective, and by that I mean, the perspective of the Western world for the most part, because it is really dominating globally now as well. And there's a certain odd notion at play at the core of this dominant perspective around this idea of value. So I tend to have an interactive classroom. I'm trying not to do that right now. I sort of ask you, what do you think of value? But I'll just press ahead. let's go to water. So I'm 10, 15 minutes in, I mentioned water. Water is something that's thought of as a thing with value by most people. Now, what that value is, though, is very interesting, because in the dominant perspective, value is something that's given to things in the world. So water is not seen as having value in itself in the dominant perspective. It is a thing out there that we may choose to give value to. So we may decide that we think water is valuable to us, principally. And that's an interesting way of thinking. That's the product of a perspective. That's not something that is dictated by the nature of the world around us. That is something we have decided to do, and I include myself in that we here, because I'm living between worlds, right? And so I'm perfectly comfortable thinking of the world this way because I was also brought up in the Western world. So it's a product of a perspective, though. It's not something that's necessarily true in itself. It's true in the sense that a large number of people now think of the world this way, but they think of the world that way because they were taught to do so. So you think of water as something that you might give value to. Next screen, please. Okay, now I want to leave this notion of perspective in the background and focus more particularly on Indigenous perspective. And what I'm going to try and do in the middle of this talk is try and convince you of the idea that Indigenous perspective on water is actually quite sensible. Now, you may have heard many people talk about this, and you may have seen a lot of literature around this idea that water is sacred. There have been, if you follow things in the media, if you're online all the time like I am, sort of following what's going on, you probably know there are lots of walks going on through this summer around water. There have been lots of movements around water in the Indigenous community. And you often see people say things about how water is understood as being sacred, that it's spiritual. Now, I'm willing to say that is something that's at the core of an Indigenous perspective on water, that water is sacred. I'm going to try and translate this, though, into something that I think is less intimidating and perhaps less worrisome if you come from things from another perspective, from the dominant perspective. What I want to do is try and describe this idea that water is sacred in a way that is still true to the meaning, but shifts the focus in a way that makes it look actually quite understandable. In fact, I would argue a better way of thinking of the world. Better in a number of ways, better pragmatically, also, I think, more accurate. What does it mean to say that water is sacred? Well, I see this as really understanding that humans are nothing but a part of the world. Right? To say that water is sacred is not to take a thing out there that you might think is a natural thing and put it into the supernatural category. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's just a mistake. Sacred things are things like, burial grounds or who knows what churches, these sorts of things. Some water that's specially been turned into something else. But generally, water is seen as just being a thing out there. It's just this stuff, chemical, very interesting properties to it. But to say that water is sacred is, in some sense, really just to acknowledge that we are part of the world. And what that means is you collapse the supernatural into the natural. You do away with this division between the supernatural and the natural. You approach the world as a biochemical living thing with you as part of it. And you don't set up any divisions between yourself and the world around you. And then if you understand the world as a whole as a sacred thing, sacred in the sense that it is everything, right? It is the entirety of our being. It is everything. And you're just part of it. Well, then water also is just part of it, is also sacred. And I'm sure I'm getting this across, but I'll keep plugging away at it to see if I can get it across. Just the idea that the world is a biochemical living thing. I've taken the world as a whole and described it as a living thing, and you might think that's a bit odd, but some of you may be familiar with the Gaia theory. Well, I've heard of that kind of idea, and if some old guy in England thought of it, then maybe it's sensible. But if you collapse the human and the world, then it's indisputable because we're part of the world. And if we're part of the world and we're clearly living, well, then the world contains living things, so the world as a whole is a living thing. But I also think there's a lot of merit to the idea that the world as a whole is itself living. So I'm not going to press the Gaia theory, but in the sense of a large, very complex, intertwined system of systems, the world is a self-regulating being that continues itself through time. And we play a role in that, and I'll come back to that at the end. That's the kind of message I want to hopefully present at the end of this. Now, going back, okay, I've introduced an Indigenous perspective. I've talked about a dominant perspective. Just for a moment, I want to mention the fact that if you put these two things side by side and you understand the Indigenous perspective in this way, it's just saying that the human is part of the world and the world itself is everything. And so there's really no categorization of supernatural and natural. Then I would say that's actually a more plausible way of thinking of the world than the dominant perspective. Because in the dominant perspective, you unpack it, there are these layers below it that really don't make sense in terms of what we actually know about the world. To think that we give value to things sets us apart from the world as some special kind of entity. Now, this has very kind of deep theological roots. I'm not going to do some sort of genealogical study of this and try and show you this, but I think most of you in the room are aware of this, that there's a very deep theological presence here. Ignoring that, there is just the fact that today people think this way, and they're brought up to think this way, as if somehow humans are special. We're the ones who can give value to things. Nothing in the world has value other than humans. You know, we have value in ourselves. We have inherent value, so I'll leave with the human rights stuff across. We have value, and we have this ability to give value to things, but things themselves don't have value. So if water has value, it has value only in the sense that it's important to a person or a group of people, or maybe to all people. Okay. Well, I would say that's an interesting perspective when you put it that way, because it's not as useful. We had this discussion this morning about the mess we're in, and why we're in this mess. I would say this is at the heart of why we're in this mess. And it also is, I think, not accurate. I mean, we're just not that way. We're not a part of the world. We're not separate from the world. And I'd like to think that everybody in this room has at some point or other been aware of the fact that this is a long memo written by Darwin to you to explain how, in fact, we are not separate from the world. It's been around for over a century. Very detailed memo. So read it. Okay, next screen, please. Back to water. So water management, that's the focus I'm going to go back to now. I'm going to gradually move back to the Peel River watershed. So water management is something that it's been touched on in the morning here and there, but we haven't really focused on it. And I want to actually suggest that of all the different ways of thinking about how we make decisions around how we use water, the most advanced form we see today is a form of watershed planning. So watershed planning is becoming more common, and the new BC Water Sustainability Act allows for watershed planning. That's good. In many ways, the new act is progressive, and it makes sense. I got to know Henry a few years ago when we were talking about the Mackenzie River Basin and the problems in doing watershed planning with the Mackenzie because it crosses different political boundaries. And I guess this afternoon we're going to be talking about the Columbia River, which crosses an international boundary. But doing watershed planning makes sense on an ecological level. Well, the most advanced form of that, most advanced progressive form, is watershed planning that is based around the idea of value pluralism. You can do watershed planning where you look at all the parties that might be inhabiting the watershed, and you can say they have interests, and you can take the interests into account. You can have some stakeholder meetings, you can get consultation off the ground, you can do all these sorts of things, and you understand that the farmers have interests, and the ranchers have interests, and the oil and gas industry has interests, and all these kinds of things are taken into some big collective mess, and some decision maker decides how they're going to allocate water between all these interests. Well, value pluralism goes a little beyond that because you understand that some of these groups have different ways of thinking of value. So they might not see water, for example, only as something that has economic value attached to it. And that's the kind of thing, for example, that we see with the process in the Yukon. It is at what is today the peak the peak of the progressive movement toward watershed planning, because under that umbrella agreement, this process was set out in a way that the Commission doesn't only see the First Nations in the Yukon as if they have interests, but also recognizes that they think of water differently, and the whole process unfolds that way. My critique of the Yukon process, though, is that the framework itself for decision-making is still left the same. That dominant perspective still dominates. It's wonderful now that you have these processes where watersheds are looked at this way. So if Indigenous people are in the watershed, They get to go to the decision-making body and talk about how they don't just have interests, they actually see things around them differently. But all that takes place in the same framework. You got a commission, a centralized authority that's given the mandate to decide how to allocate water. It all comes down again to allocating water. And how do we decide on different uses? So I want to move past this one then and suggest an alternate planning model. And this would be one that would be running in parallel with this notion of an Indigenous perspective, which I would present to you as a better way of thinking about the world. So ideally, we'd have everybody thinking this is the way to do planning around water use. You start with the idea that humans are just part of the world. Okay, we're not separate. There's no division between the natural and supernatural. There's just the world. We're part of it. If there's things that seem supernatural in it, that's because it's a wonderful place. It's got all kinds of wonderful things, and we're wonderful too. But one of the ways in which we're wonderful was touched on by David, who is still talking. Talked about the fact that we occupy a very unique position in the world, not separate from the world, but the fact is that we are able to think about it, and we're able to take on responsibilities. And you might see that then as being our primary function within the natural world is to acknowledge that we have responsibilities that come from the fact we can think about what we're doing and exercise those responsibilities appropriately. And so I'd like to suggest that what would follow from this would be a stewardship model. We would understand that we are here in the world as part of the natural world to steward the world along, to keep it going the way it seems to be designed to go. And the way it's designed to go is to create an incredibly complex, incredibly rich, biodiverse sphere. That's what it's here for, right? It's basically there to facilitate the flourishing of countless numbers of different chemical beings. And what we're doing is we're destroying that. Right? We're doing the opposite of being stewards. We're actually being the destroyers. Right? What we're doing is going out and trying to eliminate biodiversity. So what would this look like? Well, we would actually start with the presumption that we're just part of the world, and any planning process would start with the idea that we should be thinking about what our responsibilities are to the world. And we wouldn't be thinking about the world as something we give value to. The world as a whole has value in some other sense. It just is something that is our home, and we should take care of it. Now, that's all wonderful. I get the last question, which ties in, I think, with some questions from a person in the back over there. Kept asking, like, how do we get here and what do we do? Unfortunately, the question at the end is something that I just don't have any answers to because, to be honest, I don't see how we get from here to there. I have these conversations with my daughter all the time. We probably have them monthly. And we end up usually just sort of shaking our heads and saying, well, geez, I guess we're waiting for fossil fuels to run out because they're really the engine behind this. Right? There's an amazing amount of power captured in a gallon of fossil fuel. And that's what's been making possible all the engineering projects that were talked about this morning. So we do know there's an end to this. When they run out, it's going to end. The party's over. Now, we're not going to be ready for it. I think that's the message we got this morning. It's going to be a nasty end of the party process where there's just a pile of dirty garbage everywhere. And we're going to have no ability to deal with it because we're not going to have the energy sources to clean up the mess. But at the end of the day, looking ahead 1,000 years, looking out further into the future, this is going to be a bad chapter in the story of the Earth. The Earth is going to have gone through an illness. And it'll go through a bad illness. I don't think we're going to actually kill it. I don't think we're capable of doing that yet unless we unleash the nuclear weapons. We're not going to do that. 1,000 years from now, it's going to be coming out of this illness. And we're not going to play much of a role in that unless we really get our act together quick. So that, I don't know how many minutes that was. I didn't retime this. I think it's the last slide, yes? 29 minutes, there you go, okay. So I've left some time for people to challenge these ideas. Thank you.
So questions for Gordon, and a number of people spoke to me, excuse me, about the previous discussion sessions that they weren't able to hear the questions from the audience. So we're going to make an effort with Monty to run a mic around so that we ensure that everybody hears what the questions are. In fact, last session there was one question which the responder didn't even hear. So for Gordon, who would like to ask a question?
No, we don't. We can just, whoever asks a question, the 5 or 10 people around, repeat the question loudly.
Sorry to ask another question.
He's running.
That's very good.
Yeah, sorry to ask another question,
No
but
problem.
it carries on from my theme of the other questions that I asked the other speakers. And you touched a little bit on it in your talk, that we're actually destroying our world, and you got into a little bit on the theological side, for lack of a better word. So my question is do you see, how can I say this, competing forces at play in what's going on here? And so you're saying the world is a sacred place. We're part of the world. Therefore, by logic, we ourselves are sacred.
Mm-hmm.
So could you maybe expand on that a little bit? And are there views out there that look at us as not being sacred?
Yeah, I think really the dominant perspective, when you boil it down to its essentials, it's moved us away from thinking of ourselves as being sacred in the sense that I was describing it, which is not that we're somehow godlike. We like to think that with our engineering capacities, but the dominant perspectives moves us away from thinking of ourselves as having deep responsibilities. That's the way I'd say that we're sacred. We're sacred in that we're part of this amazing living thing, and we have to think about our responsibilities. What do we actually do in relation to the world around us? Well, we act, and we act with supposedly forethought. Like, we have this ability to think about what we're doing. And I would say lots of other species out there that do that as well, but we have a particular niche that we've managed to move into, going back to Norway, right? And we don't allow ourselves to play that role appropriately. We treat ourselves as if we're fruit flies, right? We go about ourselves as not actually doing the simple things we would do to not be like yeast and fill up the dish, or not be like fruit flies and fill up the environment. We're going to crash. I mean, it's just, we're like a bunch of deer on an island. We're going to have our population go to crazy levels, and then we're just going to crash. I mean, can't we see that? I mean, it seems so obvious. Now, there was something else. We had 2 questions, actually. I don't know if you got both of them or not, but I mean, I was going to add, because I thought in the middle there you're going in a direction that I didn't touch on, something about other forces and competing forces. And I think there are competing forces. Right now they're marginalized, and I would say there's actually a battle going on because the dominant perspective knows there are other perspectives and knows there are forces out there, and it's doing a wonderful job of tamping them down. David talked about environmentalists worried about audits. This particular government is looking into everybody who's doing these kinds of things. The fact is that CSIS is around listening to all the things happening, and they make it obvious to people who actually get above a certain level. They actually let them know they're watching you. And it's very intimidating, and that's just one way in which this battle is going on. The other battle that's more visible is the attempt on the part of industry to buy off Aboriginal people. That's a huge thing going on out there across Canada. And it's really meant to take a way of thinking about the world and buy it off. And unfortunately, because most Aboriginal people are aware of their traditional ways of thinking of the world, but they've also ended up in this educational system where they're taught to think of themselves as in this way. And so they get torn, and a lot of them do end up agreeing to these packages that move them away from thinking appropriately about how they have responsibilities to the world.
Okay, Paul Hurt is next, and then Suzanne.
Thanks for your talk, Gordon.
2 mics.
I want to hone in on your comment about the importance of value pluralism in planning and management.
Yeah.
And talk about the difference between value pluralism and value relativism. We, to solve problems, we have to make trade-offs and prioritize certain values over others. And I just wonder if you could say something a little bit more about how we can fix some of the problems we have and move forward in a progressive manner by honoring values pluralism, but also by acknowledging that some values need to be emphasized more than they used to be, and other values maybe need to be emphasized less. You know what I mean?
Oh, maybe. I'm not sure. I mean, I would say that much of the way you frame your question troubles me because it suggests that we're still going to operate within a dominant perspective, and that, as I'm trying to say, we should get away from that. And to get away from that, we should actually decide that there are some truths out there. And they may be things you have to argue for. I don't think these are necessarily self-evident truths, but I think it's arguable that we are, in fact, just part of the world, and so we shouldn't then think that the only question before us is about managing the interests of humans. And there was some talk this morning that suggested that is what we do. We manage the interests of humans. And we do that. But that's the mistake. Right? The mistake is to think that the only interests in this valley before us are the interests of the humans living here or pass through it or something like that. I mean, the interests of this valley are the interests of the valley. The value in the valley is in the valley. It's not something that we should then approach when problems arise as if we just need to work out whose human interests get to be prioritized over whose. So I don't know if that answered your question, but the problem is, that I know it's pie in the sky, but it's where we would have to go if we were really going to do anything substantial. We would have to not play this game. I don't want to, pick on David. He's not here. I can pick on him. But to talk about political parties, that's fun. We all love the political games, but we all know, I think, to some degree or other, that putting your hopes on some political party, especially the three that he mentioned without mentioning the fourth, those three parties are going to go in the same direction. They're all basically pro-growth, pro-development, pro-industry. That's what they are. I mean, there's subtle differences between them, but really they want to please voters. That he was right about that. And pleasing voters means, telling them that their jobs are safe, and that means telling them that things should continue to grow. We can't grow forever, right? That's what yeast does, and then it dies. So it's stupid. Right?
Paul, do you want to follow up? Do you want to ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, I don't know if I got your
I
question
guess very,
exactly.
very briefly, I actually sympathize with your point of view, and one of the values that's been overemphasized for most of the 20th century is seeing nature as a commodity, seeing its economic value as the only value worth investing in and protecting. And that's why I say when we acknowledge values pluralism, one of the problems is that we can sometimes get in a situation where we're not willing to say this value is really important, and if it comes into conflict with another value, this value should take priority.
Yeah.
And I think we need to do that occasionally.
Yep.
Okay.
I agree.
All right.
Okay. I thought I might have been misunderstanding a little bit. No,
Okay, Suzanne, you're next.
Suzanne Bailey. I remember being astonished some decades ago, realizing that the prairies developed and were completely taken over by humans in the dominant process that you're talking about in land use. And now, of course, in the last 50 years, so has the boreal. So it looks like now we're just going to go to the Arctic with the same process.
It's cold and dark up there.
Yes, well, it's cold and dark with lots of power and lots of water. And so I guess my question is, I remember seeing a map of the number of dams that are going to go on Northwest Territories rivers just to supply power to Diavik mines for diamonds, which are useless.
Yeah.
And so the question is, do you think that the indigenous peoples up there have the legal power to actually stop or inhibit or modify this dominant process? Because, and what about all the natural gas wells that are going to go in, for, that CAP has proposed, or has identified or being proposed? So is there enough power, legal power, for Native peoples to actually change this trajectory?
Great. Where's Nigel sitting? I had Nigel here who's going to feed me some law questions, but thank you for doing that. Put me back on safer ground here. I can go on. I could go on for a long time about the legal side of things. So it's very messy, actually. It would take me quite a while to unpack this. But if the question just is, do Indigenous peoples in the North have the legal power to somehow slow down or prevent the development of the North, the short answer is probably no. The more interesting part of that for me is that when people raise those questions, it's understandable that they think about the law as the Canadian legal system. And then you have this jurisprudence built up in the courts over the last 30 years or so. And I teach that, and so I know it backwards and forwards. But that is just one legal system up in the north, right? And it's only been around in the north really since the 1940s and 50s. I mean, we were left alone for a long time, which was good. But really, the north was only visited by some RCMP officers and the occasional, missionaries. So that means that for thousands of years, they had their own ways of dealing with matters. And so their own systems were there up until just recently, and they still exist, and they still have authority. Right? If a legal system is a thing that has authority, that can make rules that bind parties, those things are still there. And that's, I think, what a lot of groups are turning to now. We see it in BC a lot. The Chilcotin, after their victory last summer in the Supreme Court, they put a park in place in their territory. I don't know if you know this. You go online and look for Chilcotin Park. They put a park in place. They didn't go to BC and ask about putting a park in place. They didn't talk to anybody about it. They said, well, sounds like we're good to go. Let's put a park here. And if you look at the park, it doesn't actually fit within the land that they said they had title to. The Supreme Court of Canada gave them title to about 1,700 square kilometers of land, and the park is outside that. But Chilcotin said, we're going to take this signal that you're beginning to think we have interests, and we're just going to say, well, then let us tell you what these interests are. We have our own legal system. We have our own responsibilities to the land we live in. That's how they begin their thinking about what the laws are in their community. What are our responsibilities to the land? They had a wildlife biologist they worked with for many years come up and lay out an entire ecosystem, and that's the boundaries of the park. They said, this is what you need for a park. A park should be based on how you protect land so that you protect all the different species that use it. And that's I think, what we're going to see happening in the north to some degree. I'm not all that confident about my own community because we've gotten into very cozy relationships with the government. But I think a lot of Dene communities are going to go back to what they were saying in the 70s. There's this thing called the Dene Declaration from 1975-76, and it's a very strong declaration about their interests. They see themselves as a semi-sovereign nation who has their own legal authority, and that's where we're going to see the conflict the next 10 or 20 years is Canadian law is going to say, well, you can't stop us. And the Dene are going to say, well, that's interesting. Let me tell you about our law. And they're going to have lots of interesting conflicts about that.
Go ahead.
Thanks for your presentation. I have another legal question for you.
Oh, good.
So specifically about water, the Aboriginal Section 35 rights and water. So appreciating that the Indigenous legal perspective comes into that somewhat. Mm-hmm. But that isn't something that's been litigated that much, the Aboriginal right to water. So what's your views on sort of the potential for that?
Okay. These are easy questions. I'm like in law class. There is no Aboriginal right to water. Doesn't exist. There's a case in 1996 that set out how you determine whether a right exists as an Aboriginal right called the Vanderpeet test. And for an Aboriginal community to have a right, it has to be a tradition, practice, or custom that was integral to their distinctive society at the time of contact with Europeans. So all the Aboriginal rights that exist across Canada are actually cultural rights. And as cultural rights, they're not rights to anything. So the courts explicitly said that a number of times. There are no rights to anything. There are no rights to the trees. There's no rights to the water. There's no rights to the fish. An Aboriginal community has a right to, say, hunt, because that's a practice, or a right to fish. So if you've heard of any case in the last 30 years, they've always been about that kind of thing. It's about a practice. Now, you can make arguments in courts about how, well, if I have a right to fish, I gotta have some water around with some fish in it. And those are the kinds of arguments you can make, but they're indirect arguments, and they're not very powerful. Now, that's Aboriginal rights. A particular kind of Aboriginal right was finally manifest last summer in the Chilcotin case. That's Aboriginal title. That's a different beast, because Aboriginal title gives you a property interest over a large piece of land, and it includes the water in the land. So that's the big change in the landscape from last summer. That's why everybody's so excited about the Chilcotin decision, because now we finally do have a right. Because it's a property right, it has the potential to mean you directly have an interest in the fish, in the water, and the trees, and so on. But we're only 13 or 14 months past that, so we don't really know where it's going to go.
So my understanding of the Chilcotin decision is that it actually confirmed an existing property right. The government didn't give them property rights. The government, in point of fact, the decision recognises an existing property right. Is that not correct?
Oh boy, all right. I can answer it, but this may take a little bit of time. They speak that way at times, as if they're just recognizing a pre-existing interest, But if that were the case, well, then where was that interest for the 120-some years that Chilcotin lived in that valley between when the colony established itself and the Crown established Crown title in 2014? So that's, actually that's 160 years or so. So if they're only recognizing a pre-existing interest, well, the interest would have been there then for that period of time. Well, if you read the Chilcotin decision, the Supreme Court is very clear that that interest didn't really exist through those years. It only came into being when they said it came into being in 2014. So they, for example, I can give you lots of examples. I'll give you one. So they talk about the fact that there was a legal vacuum, they say, if the province wasn't able to regulate forestry over that valley through those years. There'd be a legal vacuum. Well, why would there be a legal vacuum if the Chilcotin have pre-existing interests in the land? I mean, they're there. They didn't move away and come back, right? They've been in that valley for probably 8,000 to 10,000 years. So, there's lots of ways in which, if you read the case carefully, you can see the court is actually saying, we think that the right comes out of the fact that the Chilcotin had been there for a long time. So there's that way in which there's a pre-existing interest. But the interest only becomes something in Canadian law when we say it's there. Okay, so it's a subtle point, but it's an important point for Indigenous people because they want to say, well, if you're going to go this halfway and say, well, we have pre-existing interests, and then you translate into something today, why don't you just recognize that we have pre-existing interests full-blown, like we're people, we have our own laws, but the court won't go that far because it leads to these kinds of conflicts I was just mentioning a few minutes ago.
There's one over here. Yes.
Hi. I just wanted to follow up on a question that was said over there. I mean, we were talking about Indigenous rights to water. What about, there are a lot of communities, even here in Alberta, where there are Aboriginal communities without clean water. Do Indigenous rights apply in that situation, or could they conceivably?
Yeah, they could conceivably. It's a hard case to make because you're arguing for something today, access to clean water, and if your only tool is to say you have these rights that are based upon your traditions, practices, and customs, for here in Alberta, I guess it'd be roughly 200 years ago. You got to go back in time roughly 200 years and discover what were the integral practices, traditions, and customs of your distinctive society back at that point, and that's where you have to ground all your rights. It's a very difficult process. If the thing you want to say today is you have a right to clean access to water, then you'd have to say it was part of your distinctive culture. It was an important part, integral part of your culture to have access to clean water at the time of contact with Europeans 200 years ago. And that may be so in the sense that we all need water. You only last a few days without water. But the courts have made it clear it has to be a distinctive practice. It has to be something that makes you who you are. Well, we all need water. So if we all need water, then how do you say it's a distinctive part of your culture that you used water 200 years ago and you're trying to say you have to have it today? It's more of a human right. So they can make arguments more successfully probably using human rights legislation and international forums and stuff like that. But they're more likely to make progress east of the Rockies using treaties, because I know we're in treaty territory here, right? So the treaties are more flexible tools in that sense. You look at the treaty rights that were provided in the treaties, and you might be able to use those in a more creative way to come up with a right to clean water. It's challenging, though. I should have started the talk today acknowledging that this is the treaty area of, I imagine, were we in treaties? Treaty 7. Yeah. Interesting, though, with this park here, I imagine everybody was moved out because it happened in Jasper and it probably happened here, I imagine.
I'm going to take two more.
Thanks.
You and then wait, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
You're next, then you, and then the guy behind you. And that will be the last two.
Okay.
You can have a break.
I have one question and one comment. I saw a film at the Calgary International Film Festival last night called Fractured Land, and I would recommend people see that film. It talks about Indigenous law, and this particular First Nations person who was filmed is at the confluence of Indigenous law and our common law, and it's very interesting, and it's going to get ugly, I think.
Yeah.
On this, my question relates to, though, how do you think that having environmental rights enshrined in the federal Constitution, guaranteeing people access to clean air, fresh water, safe food, and biodiversity would help the situation.
So to have, well, that'd be interesting because it sounds like you're talking about opening up the Constitution, which is something Canadians don't want to do. But if we could do it, if we could get to that spot, if we had an amendment to Section 35 so it included specific rights, and there were a number of conferences in the mid-'80s that were actually focused on that question. They didn't make much progress, but if we could do that today, my concern would be with some of the other stuff. It's a really complex area of law. I teach this law first-year students, and I say, well, you may think this is an easy class, but it's really complicated. Aboriginal rights under Section 35 can be infringed by the government. They can be justifiably infringed. That's the other half of this story, right? So you have the rights that you struggle for in court to try and get them established, and then the other side of the ledger is the fact that the Crown has the ability to infringe upon these rights justifiably. They have to do certain things. They basically have to have the right kind of objective in mind, and they have to acknowledge the rights as being worthy of respect. But that still allows them to do practically anything, because the objectives that are listed as objectives that they can follow, if the right is a substantial right, include basically everything. There's a funny list of these objectives in Delgamo, which is the first Aboriginal title case. So with title, the court there said the Crown can have the objective of building a dam, and that's a justifiable infringement of title. We're talking about dam building with thousands of dams. So the government can just go ahead and build a dam on title land. So if you actually have title, like the Chilcotin do, the government can still build a dam in your territory. They can also, there's some funny things in there. They can settle foreign populations. Know what that means? I don't know if they're thinking about Syrians coming into the Aboriginal title lands. I don't know what they're talking about. So that whole business is complicated. So if these rights were enshrined in Section 35, well, Section 35 rights are not protected in any serious way. They're actually much less protected than charter rights or other rights. They're open to being infringed fairly easily.
In the Charter of Rights.
Oh, no, in the charter. Well, Section 35 is not in the charter.
No, but I'm talking about having environmental rights.
Oh, just generally?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you meant, okay, generally. Well, that might be different, because the charter is more protected than Section 35. Yeah. Go ahead. Let's get it done. That would be good. That would help.
Janet Keeping, Green Party of Alberta. I just note that, so thank you. Recognizing something about the Greens and their existence. But my question actually follows up quite nicely with the previous one. I don't know as much as I'd like to know, and I am trained as a lawyer. I don't know as much as I'd like to know about the different kinds of bills of environmental rights that exist around the world. But my question was whether you do, and whether you think there's anything really substantially useful in the bills of environmental rights that give rights to the elements of our ecosystems and not just to people, giving rights to the river or rights to the watershed. Is there anything to that, or is that just kind of confusing and window dressing?
I just met Nigel Banks a few minutes ago. Where's Nigel? There he is. That's a question for you. So, law professor from the University of Calgary, and Nigel would be much more versed in all that than I am. What I could say is that, when I think about those matters, about putting things into rights language, I also have, my own critiques of rights language. So along the lines of what I was talking about this morning, it's a way of thinking of the world that really allows us to get away from dealing with the big problems. If you put things in rights language, what are rights? I mean, rights are things we give to things against. Like we give value to things. Some things we value a lot, and we give rights to them, right? And it really just sets us up again for this question about how you allocate things between rights holders, which is just an elevated level.
I'm almost embarrassed to ask such a sort of trivial question in the face of the really deep ideas that you were presenting.
I thought the name of
as a
the
law professor, whether you'd ever thought about it.
I thought the name of the program was good. In deep. I was trying to go really deep. Thank you.
Okay, last questions, the gentleman in the back there.
Uh-oh. The student of mine.
I would like to sort of try to wrap my head around
Give me a softball. Come on.
the softball question. Here's the lob. A lot of the work that I've been doing with you and a lot of work that I've been doing with my students surrounds the question. My name's Don McIntyre. I'm from University of Lethbridge, but it surrounds the idea of sort of how we characterize, how we actually talk about it. And a couple of things come up. One, the way we bounce between Aboriginal rights and then talk about it as an Indigenous right.
Mm-hmm.
and how those become two very different things. In law, Aboriginal is three specific groups. Indigenous is a happier, friendlier, huggier sort of approach to it. What I would like to ask you about is, can we look at sort of the Indigenous perspective, which includes everybody with regards to water, and say that really what we're looking at is, as you described it, looking at where the responsibility. So when we talk, rather than talking about rights, we move further and further away from what obligations we have and more towards who owes me, who owes me something. Whereas if we start to look and say, well, what obligations do we have to the water? What obligations does the water have to me? That seems to be the Indigenous perspective. And I think it becomes echoed or seen when we start to look back at something like riparian rights, which said that you have obligations to everybody else on the watershed. So to go back to your idea of the watershed, if we can suddenly say, and I'll put it into the form of a question now, Alex, can we look and say that the perspectives, the two perspectives, opposing perspectives that you presented, are actually much closer, provided that we strip away all of the excess and the way we've started to couch how we talk about rights, because we stop talking about the obligations that come with those rights.
Yeah, well, okay. I'm trying to keep my response short, and we'll chat about this later. Yeah, I agree to some extent, except the problem is that I think you have to move beyond just couching things in rights language, because rights language is built on this foundation that rights are primary and obligations are secondary. So you really want to invert the language. If you want to push rights into the background, you do it by saying rights are things we can introduce once we get our language around responsibilities and obligations firmly established at the foundation. And then rights become secondary. I don't know what role they play there, but they become secondary. So I agree with you, but I think we still want to begin with the idea that we are stewards of a very particular kind. We're not stewards of things in the world for our use. We're stewards of things because that's our responsibility to the world, to be stewards to it. So, thanks.
Thank you. Will you join with me in thanking Gordon Christie for his presentation?